Psychic Politics, an Aspect Psychology book by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Continuation Part 3, Chapter 24, Stages of Consciousness. Several months before I began this book, I had an extremely rich perceptive experience, but it was literally impossible to describe. Being me, I wrote down what I could and ended up with a description that sounded adequate enough. It made sense, but the very sense of it was almost meaningless in other terms that escaped me once the event was over. I was so frustrated by the description, in fact, that I shelved the notes. It was these that I discovered after Doreen's call. The event had happened on a Friday night. Rob went to the store to pick up snacks for expected guests. I stayed at home to straighten up the living room and do the dishes. When I was finished, I stood at the bay windows of the apartment, brooding. I was in between books, waiting for some kind of inspiration. The scene and the circumstances reminded me of a similar evening when I'd seen my, quote, rain creature, end quote, a vision described in Adventures in Consciousness, the book. I looked back toward that experience nostalgically. Seth, Seven, Cypress, and Helper, were they parts of my psyche? Independent? Question. Both? Question. Seven and Cypress together had given my novel, The Education of Oversoul 7. Helper seemed to operate as a healer. Quote, well, whatever, I said mentally. I'd like some action and help now myself, end quote. Then I remembered the oak tree outside the kitchen window and thought of it. So secure in the earth, so in touch with its own treedom. So I said mentally that I'd sure like to be in touch with my own inner knowledge in the same way, or words to that effect. I'm going to include my original notes here to show not only what happened, but the way I described it and my frustration with the description itself. Quote, all at once, the air and the night attained that characteristic additional beauty and significance. Kids were riding bikes upon the bridge, which is not yet opened, and the new lights came flooding on, illuminating the scene with an unearthly light. I was very aware of the voices in the street and the cricket sounds, indescribably sweet and dear, and the crickets were the sounds of the gods speaking. Then came one of those everything is in God experiences. I don't know how else to describe it. I stared at a plant on the windowsill, and it was God-knowing greenness, but individualized greenness eternally individualized. and I knew that everything in the universe was absolutely safe. I'm scribbling this down just after the experience, but the words don't scratch the emotional realities I sensed. But there are some kind of messages that sweep through the world constantly and help form it, invisibly beneath what we see. And I sensed those. In a way, I knew that my mind's independence rises from Seth's, and that this applies to other people too, with their equivalent of Seth. I felt that Seth's reality is part spiritual but partly in nature also, but mostly that there are psychological and psychic forces, a whole different category, like gravity and so forth, but on another level. These are supportive psychological forces as dependable as the physical forces we know and rely upon. They're substructures of personality from which our present beings spring, and they operate as the basis of our psychological life. The vocabulary I'm using just isn't saying what I want. In the weirdest way, the words are right in certain terms, but completely wrong in others. For example, I was going to say that I knew, while the experience was happening, that love is a force as real as gravity, operating between psyches instead of objects. But what I felt is so different from the word, quote, love, end quote, so much larger and grander and yet smaller. That word, quote, love, end quote, as it's usually used, is meaningless in the same context. I felt that there are states of being quite as real as the physical world, many in a given universe, sharing portions, say, of the earth at the same time, but responding to and aware of different aspects of it. While the experience was going on, I sensed all this non-verbally. I felt that I was moving toward one of those other states, a new one for me, and that an honest desire to know moves you from one state of being to another, where love, that word again, is literally a moving force. You do see more clearly when you love. I felt that I was being reloved, like reworked, as if this love was quickening and balancing molecular structures inside my body. As that happened, I felt very sleepy. As I write up these notes, something is happening now. I'll try to describe it as I go along, if I can. All this changes to a body thing. Inside, my head swirls. The room looks new and fresh. I sense, barely see, a giant self behind me, towering. It's in the same position I am. It's the pattern of which I came. It's like a shadow, more defined than an ordinary shadow, but not bulky. I get uneasy thinking that I can merge with it, decide not to. At the same time, I sense and almost see a giant cat behind Willie, our cat. It's giant-sized too, and rises from floor to ceiling or vice versa as mine does. And it's the pattern of Willie. I'm so relaxed that I'll have to stop doing these notes on the spot. After writing the above, I lie down on the bed and suddenly felt as protected and safe as a child with loving parents nearby. Though again, the words, quote, protected, end quote, and, quote, safe, end quote, just don't come anywhere near describing the kind of super safety I experienced. For a moment I was a child in a crib. I understood what was behind the phrase, quote, children of God, end quote, but also saw that the phrase was misleading in the same way the word, quote, love, end quote, was when I used it. At the same time, even as I felt, the super safety and the children of God sensations, I felt an intellectual protest from my usual level of activity. At the super safe level, I understood why people referred to God as a father, and knew that to other kinds of consciousness, one of our lives is equivalent to perhaps one a year at their scale, so that after 7 lives, we'd still be like 7-year-olds to them. With all my notes, the greater elements of the experience itself escaped translation. As I read the notes, I realized that the giant self and cat patterns were my first attempt to sense the models mentioned so often in this book. The next day, as I sat at my desk, the following material came to me. I knew that it was connected with the previous day's experience, but somehow it didn't click for me. It wasn't until after Doreen's call that I understood in the proverbial flash how pertinent this material was. And it had been there all the while, waiting for me to catch up to it. Reading it over, I saw at once where the codicils fit in. Center of the page, bold, all-capped letters, the stages of consciousness. Like many other people, I've been afraid of my own greater reality. I was used to identifying me with only a small portion of myself, quote, me the writer, end quote, because I thought in terms of me versus not me. In our society, once you begin to glimpse the self's wider abilities and range, you're afraid that the self as you knew it earlier will be swept aside, shown to be inferior, or somehow be annihilated. Instead, the, quote, old self, end quote, is only a small glimmer of true selfhood. The, quote, old self, end quote, grows and assimilates the new knowledge and becomes the new self, it is illuminated, expanded, and continues as organizer. But it does have to open its doors to its own vaster reality and allow itself to be illuminated by its own source. Sometimes, the focused personality as the known self becomes frightened because of its own beliefs and sets up barriers to psychic growth that are in direct proportion to the sensed expansion. The state of consciousness that we consider normal, the official line of consciousness, is only a threshold to natural quote, progressions, end quote. To one extent or another, each person tries to grow out of that framework, or rather, to expand it. In doing so, the following stages of consciousness become apparent: all caps, all by itself, bold, stage 1, new paragraph. The focused personality initiates the beginning of the expansion process and begins to perceive unofficial information. This usually involves some startling dream, vision, or conversion experience. Automatic writing may be involved, use of the Ouija board, or any process that allows the psyche extra breathing space and motion. This stage may or may not include checkable precognitions or telepathic instances. There is great leeway here, and many variations in the intensity and depth of the initial experience. While the initial event may happen suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, it is actually the result of a long process in which the focused personality has been gradually casting about for new creative expansion, and some freedom from restrictions that limits its range. New paragraph, all by itself, caps, bold, stage 2. In stage 2, the focused personality tries to continue its expansion, while attempting to maintain its previous orientation with the world and to correlate its unofficial information in terms of its religious and cultural beliefs. At this stage, for example, we will usually try to prove that our visions are true in the world's terms. For example, if you begin with automatic writing that gives extraterrestrials as its source, you might then try to prove that these beings exist. If the writing provides any checkable precognitions or telepathic data, then you will be convinced that the space people, rather than you, possess these abilities. If, like the engineer mentioned earlier, you discover that the space people don't exist in those terms, you might throw the whole thing over in disgust. At this point, and not use this opening wedge or understand that the psychic events were important even if their clothing was symbolic. The initial psychic event is often dramatic, even outrageous in normal terms, simply to get our attention. It may be psychological art, involving the entire personality, bringing all the senses into play in a pageantry as brilliant as any stage drama, for our eyes and experience alone. Yet we judge it at this stage according to the most rigid true and false standards. In a way, such experiences, visions, revelations, and some trance personifications are bigger than life, or rather, bigger than our ideas of what life and existence are. For this reason, many people stay at stage 2 in a dilemma, trying to interpret psychic events in a framework too small, or staying in a fairly cozy religious or pseudo-scientific circles, which provide some freedom from the official line of consciousness by allowing psychic ventures if they follow certain set conventions characteristics of the group. Unfortunately, such a course often hampers the focused personality from developing further, and if the latest unofficial data contradicts the, quote, party line, end quote, then the person is out in the cold again. Many trance personalities develop in stage 1 finally become psychologically invisible at stage 2, or become frozen in development, mouthing the current psychic, religious, or pseudo-scientific dogma. All of this can cloak the originality of psychic content. At the same time, genuine creativity can emerge, and when it does, the individual is better able to cope in the normal world than before, better able to solve problems, and perhaps quite content to use such a dogma as a comfortable container until experience spills over the edges and another stage is reached. In other words, the ready-made symbols of religion and pseudoscience are probably helpful to many people, providing them with an orientation for inner activity and growth. If the arrangement becomes permanent, however, further experiences are programmed too rigidly. Such people never work through to the truly personal, original aspects hidden within. These stages, left alone, will mirror the aspects of the psyche being activated. They will show themselves in ways characteristic of the psyche and of the focused personality. Seth, Seth 2, Sumari, 7, Cypress, and Helper represent this kind of motion in my case. Latent creative abilities might be personified as a muse, for example, and the focused personality might be presented with new skills or interests. This personalized, tailor-made assistant of the psyche to the focused personality may not emerge, however, if rigid concepts continue to cloak the experiences. Stage 2 is replete, more often than not, with the good and bad spirits of religion and myth. Caps, all bold in the center, Stage 3. Stage 3 is literally worlds away from Stage 2. Here the focused personality becomes reassured enough to accept new data as a part of a greater reality in which the physical world is couched. It is ready for true self-fulfillment, which means identifying with portions of the psyche formerly considered not self. The need for sacrifice or, quote, death of the self, end quote, exists only in stages 1 and 2, when arbitrary standards between self and not self predominate. This third stage, however, is the one interpreted in religious terms as the death of the self and the new birth, the death of the will, or in other concepts of similar nature. To my way of thinking, these are quite distorted, actually. The focused personality learns that nothing works for it but the new orientation, fully accepted. This means that it expands, accepts its own larger framework, and sees that nothing is lost. In fact, the world is gained in a new way. This stage can be a quick moment of realization, or a gradual trial and error process in which the focused personality fluctuates between stages 1 and 2 until it finally receives enough momentum to break through to stage 3. In the center, caps, bold, stage 4. Stage 4 is a new self-country in which the focused personality realizes that the assumptions of the one-line official consciousness only apply at that level. They are dropped as valid descriptions of reality and treated as respected local ordinances. The seeming contradictions between intellect and intuitions, good and evil, object and subject, vanish. The contradictions. This stage can be a fleeting one of varying duration. For that matter, the divisions between the stages as given are arbitrary to some degree. Certain people will have flashes of stage 4 consciousness in any of the other states. Overall, though, these are the stages through which we come to psychic maturity. To some extent or another, they take place in each person regardless of culture. They represent intuitive revelation and assimilation. Again, some ancient civilizations provided mobile groups of symbols as guidelines. In our society, the official line of consciousness is pre-stage 1, as given, a prerequisite for the other states as it provides a sturdy physical basis. We stifle its development at this point, however, and form an entire world and culture around a specific and local area of consciousness. This level is particularly disadvantageous because its assumptions seem to be the only criteria for reality, since unofficial data that would show alternate patterns is discouraged. Other stages of consciousness immeasurably fill out usual reality, adding depths and nuances not generally perceivable, and provide their own kind of evidence. In a strange manner, these other stages fulfill and expand ordinary consciousness by bringing in other kinds of stimuli. We don't recognize such natural stages of growth and change, however. Yet a normal progression might very well lead to an understanding of death itself, for we would have evidence for the independence of consciousness from body focus. Previously, our psychological therapies have been devoted to returning the strays back to the folds of the official line, acting to reinforce the very psychological systems that retarded psychic growth, meaning the development and expansion of the psyche in relationship to its inner and outer activity. My own experience seems to involve frequent, but never frequent enough, journeys to stage 4, followed by a simulation of data gained there by my usual consciousness. I have discovered that now the lines tend to blur considerably, in that I regard as normal alterations of consciousness that once seem exotic. That is, I switch to various stages with relative ease. Stage 4, though, is not a steady, permanent stage by any means, practically speaking, but it casts its aura over the other stages, immeasurably adding enjoyment and appreciation of the natural world. Again, I think that these are natural stages, experienced to some degree by everyone. Beyond our states of ecstasy, almost impossible to sustain in normal living, and the mark of the mystic state. End notes. As soon as I came upon these notes, I saw instantly where the codicils fit in. They aren't visible at our official level of consciousness, and for that matter, at the living area or usual experience area they seem to contradict known facts. I saw where my earlier confusion originated. The codicils made perfect sense to me, were clear and apparent, when I was in the same state of consciousness in which I received them, and in all of my other altered states. The codicils are accepted facts of existence to Seth, Sumari, Seven, and Helper, who operate at that level of reality habitually, while I experience it only in brief snatches. They exist under conditions in which space-time doesn't apply, beyond concepts of good and evil where there are no contradictions. In other words, the contradictions of their reality and the portions of the psyche to which they correspond are different than ours. Seth, too, a personality allegedly more advanced than Seth, and whom I've had some experience, seems to exist at a still more distant level. In some stages of consciousness, I've sensed realities that didn't fit my own neurological patterns. I could feel myself making all kinds of inner adjustments to bring them in, knowing that I was squeezing them out of shape to do so. But these may represent even further removed components of our own being, impossible to describe, quote, ancient, end quote, sounds, earth memories couched in an entirely different language, but alive at a molecular level in our flesh. Seth, Sumari, Seven, Cypress, and Helper may be aspects of my psyche that operate at other stages of consciousness all the time then, reflected through my experience but becoming activated for me only when I move to those levels myself. I'm a poet and writer, so my interests helped activate those aspects that suited my intents. Helper isn't utilized to the fullest, most probably because the healing abilities of my own personality are merged with the writing. Sumari definitely allows me to express musical abilities, though that had been completely submerged and unorganized before. Other people might activate other aspects primarily, as in spirit doctors. But even if freedom were allowed, these aspects would be highly individualized rather than conventionally programmed. Certainly, aspects often show themselves in dictated or automatic artistic productions of one kind or another. When such talents suddenly emerge from a previously smothered state. Just lately, a woman artist sent me 2 groups of snapshots, one of a previous painting done in her normal manner, and one of, quote, spirit paintings, end quote. It was obvious that her earlier work was stereotyped, conventionally pretty, but lacking any real depth. Then suddenly she was presented with mental images of pictures that she was directed to paint. These utilized geometrical figures mostly, and she, quote, knew, end quote, that these originated with spirit artists. She now had, quote, spirit commissions, end quote. Her creativity had jumped out of previous limitations. Somehow the circles and abstract shapes had more feeling in them than her previous work, but it was being experienced in another conventional framework. She was activating the creative aspect of the psyche, directing it into her painting, however, and her work was charged with as much power as she could interpret and translate. Spirit artists simply seem more believable to some people than the psyche's great energy. In any case, the focus of consciousness causes the conditions of experience. For example, at our usual level, it's pretty difficult to believe that the universe is safe and man is good. All kinds of contradictions instantly arise, contradictions that exist as conditions at that particular focus. When, in stage 2 of consciousness, you try to correlate intuitive data with the official level, these contradictions become more apparent than ever. They have to be dealt with one way or another. You almost have to move to stage 3 to make such intuitive material work, tuning into the system of reality in which the codicils are the new facts. Yet the aspects, with their own distinctive levels of consciousness, are also threaded through our official focus. When we alter our focus to some extent, we tune in to these other realities that underlie our own. They usually are not expressed in isolated form. The aspects merge to form our psychic and physical being. They would probably be called archetypes by some people, considered potent components of the unconscious, to be treated with kid gloves. The idea being that our individuality is so precariously poised that it is in constant danger of being submerged in its own unconscious elements. It never seems to occur to us that our particular kind of individual consciousness is natural and rises from the psyche as easily as leaves grow from trees. The unconscious forms conscious focus, needs it, seeks it out, and operates in the objective world through its auspices. The unconscious is the constant creator of our individuality and not its great usurper, not the dark king ever ready to do us in and set up its own kingdom instead. Without the unconscious, there'd be no conscious kingdom to begin with. Such beliefs in the threatening elements of the unconscious make us fear the source of our own being and hamper the fuller facets of individuality possible with encouragement of the aspects. Our fears and beliefs cause whatever difficulties do arise. As a rule, we just don't feel or examine the shifting guises our consciousness takes, so we can't identify with our own psychological motion. When we become aware of anything but the most usual perceptions, then our psychological mobility seems to come from outside of us. Yet the aspects, with their own strands of consciousness, interweave just beneath our focus all the while. The aspects, which also operate as models, are also highly individualistic, however, unique, suited to each of us personally and to no other. When we form them into rigid psychic molds on the one hand, or treat them as mass unconscious principles on the other, then we lose their original vision, which is also our own. We end up with a standardized package of Tibetan master, Buddha, Christ, spaceman, or whatever. It's because the aspects are basically unique that we can trust them, they're geared to our individual needs and desires, and know the extent of our abilities better than we do at our usual operating level. They can help solve our problems, and in reaching out beyond our own level of consciousness, we actually take the first step toward an enlarged vision in which seeming problems and contradictions dissolve. Yet in their uniqueness, the aspects are also universal, since they underlie our private and mass experience. They are, quite literally, the facets of the soul. We follow the authority of the psyche unquestioningly, as it propels us into birth and through it, forming our very lives with exquisite precision. The child trusts the authority of the psyche and knows that it is blessed because it exists. The child realizes that its own existence springs out of something so intimate that its being is beyond question, beyond fact. We are the unknown made known, spirit made flesh, transubstantiation in the truest meaning of the word. And what is, quote, the word, end quote, we hear spoken of so frequently in various religions, question. It doesn't speak in syllables and volumes alone, or even primarily, but through atoms, molecules, blood, bone, and flesh. Its, quote, sound, end quote, comes alive through the living properties of the body, just as if these letters could fly off the page, fully conscious, to form endless sentences on their own, endowed with all the abilities of this writer, able to create their own books, question their own origin and mind, and speculate about the birth of alphabets. The psyche is innocent. My psyche is innocent, and so is yours. Our impulses are good. Left alone, they'll lead us naturally towards self-fulfillment and allow us to contribute in the best way to the race at large. I believe that our impulses are as good as our cells, meant to add to our psychic development as the cells add to physical development, and that our impulses, followed with an understanding of their nature, would ensure survival of the race and allow it to follow its greatest potentials. Yet we constantly believe that our impulses are bad and that following them would lead to destruction. At our official levels of consciousness, with its prejudged perception, this certainly seems to be the case. Yet each of us feels the burden of unrealized potential. Correspondents may write to thank me for the books, ask help, or tell their own experiences. But one thread runs through all the letters, the search for purpose. Quote, I know I have a purpose, end quote, one woman writes. Quote, but I don't know what it is. I know I want to help others too, but in what way? Question, end quote. The individual psyche knows and would gladly answer, yet we ignore our own impulses, those stimuli that would set our inner purposes into motion. We've learned to doubt our own vitality, so the suggestion that we trust the authority of the psyche sounds like sheer nonsense at best, and at its worst it suggests dangerous license, encouraging our most destructive tendencies. Yet as we move towards stage 3 of consciousness, we see clearly that the psyche is innocent, and that our impulses represent psychological and psychic motion, leading to growth and development. At stage 4, we're able to use that knowledge to enrich normal living. While we're at stage 4, we make the codicils work long enough and powerfully enough so that we're certain of their validity. Stage 4, I believe, is our most advantageous natural state of consciousness, a beginning framework, one seldom reached except in brief snatches, at least in comparison to the time spent at the official level. I'm at stage 4 often as I write. A book is a challenge, it takes physical time and effort. Yet while this time is spent in a normal way, the writing is exceptionally easy, spontaneous, and natural. In creative endeavors, we're most familiar with these rhythms of consciousness, this constant translation of inner data into recognizable form. But I believe that the focused personality is meant to blend these states far more extensively than it does, merging the aspects into a richer and more effective earth-tuned experience. Perhaps the Garden of Eden story represents our choice of the one-line type of consciousness, stating symbolically what we were relinquishing, our innocence, and what we were gaining, the experience of duality. If so, to what purpose? Perhaps the focused personality had to concentrate on a one-line focus to establish an initial stable framework, while knowing that eventually the focus itself would recognize its limitations and seek its source. Yet when it does, a new, unique kind of consciousness results, not simply a return to innocence, but the achievement of a knowing innocence, something quite different, an innocence that can appreciate itself, a youth not wasted on youth type of psychological finesse. Such a condition weds knowledge with innocence and merges intellect and intuitions to form a new synthesis of consciousness that is beyond the reach of intellect or intuitions alone. When it reaches a certain point and is not allowed to fulfill itself through expansion, the linear consciousness with its assumptions leaps to contradictions, illnesses, and fears. The codicils, as a new group of assumptions, release energy and dissolve the barriers of previous beliefs, unifying experience. Most illnesses, I believe, are caused by blockages of energy, resulting from linear assumptions about reality, actually by the strain that develops between the focused personality's need for development, expansion, and spontaneity, and its adherence to old beliefs that attempt to standardize and limit its experience. As I read over my notes on the stages of consciousness, it became more obvious than ever that the level we consider normal is tension generating after it reaches its peak of achievement and builds up pressure meant to propel it to a new level. Again, but we inhibit this natural development, for which I believe we are biologically triggered. In Chapter 24. Peace, light, and love. Aloha. It's Valentine's Day today.